In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers, all you crazy commies out there. It's I, Douglas Lain, author of Bash Revolution, Wave of Mutilation, and a very short speech which I gave at my daughter's wedding over the weekend. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker.
Congrats, Doug. I'm so happy to hear that your daughter got married.
Yeah, it was a nice thing. I cried. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I'm Benjamin Studebaker, political theorist with a PhD from Cambridge, author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
So today we are going to be discussing the crisis, the constitutional crisis around Trump. I guess if I were going to go backwards, the most important point to cover would be the attacks on due process that he is launching, then the First Amendment concerns that are being raised, and then finally the more prosaic and normal questions around tariffs, which I don't think bring with them a concern about a constitutional crisis, although I may be wrong there. But I am wondering where you would arrange things in terms of Trump's weaknesses, or how you would understand this moment politically.
Oh, God. Let's just suppose for a minute. Let's suppose that we're Democrats, okay? Our only goal is to get rid of Trump. That's all we want to do. We have no further objectives really to speak of. We just want to get rid of Trump because we don't like him. We think he's crazy and maybe a fascist, right?
Okay.
Now, we know that statistically, right-wing politicians do better when you talk about immigration. We know this. That said, what the president is doing in terms of sending a guy to El Salvador, to one of these horrific El Salvador prisons, really offensive, repulsive, not respecting the due process rights of the guy. Maybe he's in a gang, maybe he's a very bad guy. Doesn't matter. He has due process rights. The court has ordered him to respect them, and he should respect them. So we want to fight in court on this issue because we care about this. Should we be trying to make this into a constitutional crisis in the media for the purposes of trying to get rid of the president? In the UK, the Conservative Party, when it was struggling politically because of the economy, because of the Brexit and COVID and the difficulties in managing the consequences of those things, when it was struggling, it announced a plan to deport immigrants in the UK to Rwanda. It's called the Rwanda Plan. The goal of the Conservative Party in proposing this was to make the left oppose the plan, to have a plan that was so morally disgusting that the left would have to talk about how awful it was and would have to center the legal fight to stop the Rwanda Plan in its messaging and in its yakking. That is exactly what's going on here. You have an administration that is having political difficulties doing its trade policy. It is running up against significant opposition in Congress. It's got significant opposition from the bond market and from the chairman of the Federal Reserve. There are real questions about whether it's going to be able to deliver on its economic agenda. And instead of talking about that, they want to center immigration, center it for the purposes of trying to produce a situation where they can impeach him, even though Congress is controlled by the Republicans. So they're not going to impeach him. And if they were to impeach him, they would get J.D. Vance, who they all agree is worse. They all think J.D. Vance is worse at this stage. That doesn't make any sense. And again, this is a case of trying to get him on a technicality through the legal process, trying to get the courts to damage him politically. And they did the same frickin' thing in the first administration. In the first Trump administration, He polled at his lowest level. He was at about 37% approval when he was doing the tax cut for the rich people and repeal and replace. And you can look it up. In late 2017, that's when his poll numbers hit the lowest level that they hit of the whole term. Now, what did they do in 2018? They spent the whole year trying to get him on legal technicalities, trying to impeach him, trying to find some way of getting him on some sort of process-related matter. And his numbers go up in response to that. And if you look at his approval numbers, they've gone up in the last week. They've gone up significantly. You can look at it and see already in the data that his numbers have gone up as they've been talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So stupid, Doug. They are so stupid. It is incredible to me because I talked to a lot of these people over the course of the last few years, and they said, oh, we've learned things. We've recognized that this is not the way to do it. Having this very elite-oriented strategy of making it about the law and making it about process, we understand that this isn't what is effective. And what are they doing now? They run right back to all of this stuff. They're not able or willing to talk about the economy or trade or anything that has anything to do with the American citizen's standard of living and quality of life for any length of time. Their brains are not able to stay on these issues for any length of time. They have no fortitude. They have no endurance. And as soon as something happens, which is morally upsetting to them from the point of view of bourgeois morality, that is all they can frickin' talk about. And if you raise these kinds of objections, they'll go, oh, you don't care enough about the issue. Is there something wrong with you? Are you someone who supports this kind of stuff? So they go right back into the cancel culture. Maybe there's something wrong with you. Stuff that they used to do. They slide right back into that immediately. Like nothing ever happened. They have learned absolutely nothing. It's incredible to me, Doug, how really, really stupid and debased the conversation has been in the last week.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with you. Just as I pretend to be a Democrat, I think that you're right. The problem is that we're dealing with a faction of the Democrats who don't believe they are Democrats, so they don't have to worry about trying to beat Trump on in a conventional way, electorally. They pretend they have some other objective. So that's why they can retreat into moralism, I think. Would you agree with that? Like, if you're like, I think
these are all people who said to vote for Harris because it's important to beat him by any means necessary. A lot of these people said to vote for Harris. Not all of them, but a lot of them did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I know, but I'm saying even they can, in this moment, stop being so practical because their role in the Democratic Party is as the kind of militant, bratty, not so rational.
Because they think it works like some kind of Overton window where you just say crazy things and then somehow the median point in the discussion moves toward you. Instead of repelling people by taking positions that alienate them ultimately, they think that anytime you say anything that's on one side of the political spectrum, that it's just like a magnet or something that tows the center toward them. So they think that nothing they say can cause any trouble. The thing is, they acknowledged and admitted, many of them, that the strategy and tactics and the rhetoric that were used in the last decade didn't work like that and did, in fact, cause trouble. They acknowledged that a lot of this open borders, abolish ICE stuff that was tried, this focus on immigration that was tried in the first administration, was counterproductive politically for them on its own terms for them, given their goals and objectives. Many of them acknowledged it. And now they slide right back into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, okay, I'm going to try to be an advocate for this position and see if I can do it. I'm going to pick the devil's advocate position and say, look, in the last election, a faction of our own party moved to Trump. Not a significant faction, but a faction that might be an indicator of future loss for us in terms of future losses from the base. You had people who liked RFK Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya, just as two examples, who were very much concerned about civil liberties and the way in which our own party was undermining the Constitution. So it is in our interest to target these people and bring them back. And also, it will be useful for us to point out the hypocrisy of that faction as they fail to adequately combat Trump on these issues.
No, they lost these people because of the cost of living. And now you have a president who's engaged in a trade policy that might, in the near term, even if it's ultimately successful, raise the cost of living.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you focus on. You focus on, if you're trying to beat him, the sense in which even if he is successful, in the near term, he'll raise the cost of living. And if you're an older worker who's near retirement or retired, he'll put your budget into some doubt. He'll mess up your timeline. Those are the things that they should be focusing on.
Right.
That's the vast bulk of the people who were interested in him. They thought that he was going to bring back the economy from 2019, because in the Biden administration, median family income never returned to the 2019 level. For all their chatter about how great the Biden economy was, you can look at the Federal Reserve economic data. It never came back to the 2019 level during the Biden administration. The interest rate being as high as it was made housing unaffordable for young people. So many young people are not on the housing ladder who otherwise would have been, and they don't have a stake in what happens in the near term. They're frustrated. They're ticked off. This is the stuff that it was cost of living and immigration. Those were the two issues, cost of living and immigration, at the top of all of the data sets that we have for why. And they were acknowledging this. They were going, oh, we lost for these reasons. They were talking about it. But, it's just like after 9/11, when there was a couple of weeks where people talked about, are we doing things in the Middle East that are not working out, such that we have people so worked up about us that this kind of stuff is happening? Do we need to rethink maybe our Middle Eastern policy and interact differently with the countries there to try to soothe some of this anger and frustration that exists out there? And after a week or so of talking about it, it was just decided, no, they hate us because of our freedom. And all that there is for us to do is to just go after them. And in the same way, we have all of these false moments of reflection where to somebody like me who writes books and likes to reflect all the time, occasionally it seems like, oh, a bunch of people are interested in doing this with me now. Maybe they'll continue to be interested in doing it with me, but it's never true. That window closes, and then they go right back to the same kinds of thinking that were dominant before, and there's no learning at all. And how can we learn? How can we make any kind of progress, as socialists or even just progressive liberals? How can they make any progress without a sense of history that they can learn from? Without some kind of ability to process events, make sense of them? And this is something that the Socialist Party used to do. It's something that having any kind of collective organization with a common history and certain shared common knowledge objects or certain goals, certain normative objectives should have a capacity to do. There's no capacity to do it on the left at all for any length of time. It's just shocking.
I'm really uncomfortable pretending to be a Democrat, because for so long I was a Democrat without really admitting it to myself, and I feel like I finally shed that predilection, and I want to get rid of it. So let me ask you this: if we are thinking of ourselves as socialists, how should we approach this moment where the right to due process seems to be weakening because of the way in which these supposed gang members are being deported without due process? Or, not just them, the students who's had their green cards and visas taken on the flimsiest of pretexts based on the content of their speech. So there's both the First Amendment and a due process problem with them. what should we be doing to protect our rights so that we will have more freedom to organize politically in the future? And I say this as someone who became incensed about the Twitter files and the attacks on free speech that came from the Democrats, and who was not concerned with either helping or hurting the Republican Party. And then, as I attacked Biden and his various so-called left-wing supporters around that. So I do think that we are challenged to learn from this moment and think through how we should go about protecting our rights as socialists right now, which is a different thing than trying to get Democrats elected or trying to get Donald Trump out of office. So what would you say to that question? How would you answer that question?
Well, of course, all of this stuff that is happening where people are having their green cards or their student visas taken away on the basis of things they've said, or even on the basis of weird technicalities. I've heard stories of people losing green cards or visas on the basis of speeding tickets, or even speeding tickets that were subsequently overturned because these states are misreporting them as having criminal records, and then the feds are responding by taking away their student status. This is stuff that has to be fought, of course, in the courts, has to be, but doesn't necessarily need to be our focal point in terms of how we think about what is going on. It doesn't need to monopolize all of our attention, particularly with public messaging that's for ordinary working people. We don't need to get dragged along by the Democratic Party and its various mistakes in what it chooses to emphasize in its public messaging, and then not look at things that are happening and developing around the world and not gain an understanding. This is a moment where major things are happening, and there's an opportunity to learn things about how the world system works, how powerful is the United States in the world system today relative to other states. Major things are going to come out of this. And right now, even if you're very well educated and you've really followed this stuff, it's a test of all of our theories about it. It's a test of everybody who thinks that China is ready for prime time. It's a test of that theory. Everybody who thinks that the United States is still the powerful dominant state, it's a test of that theory. We have an opportunity to learn some really important and valuable stuff if we can focus on it for any length of time. This stuff, of course, should be fought in the courts. Obviously, it should be fought. It's terrible, wretched, and bad, but that doesn't mean that it should be the focal point of our attention when there is a trade war going on, which is a struggle to reshape the entire global economic system. As socialists, we have to be interested in that.
Right. Okay. Listen, I do want to get to the trade war. I do want to raise the Venezuelan gangs, MS-13, and the deportations again, though, before we do, because I want to look. Here's what I think. I think that as a socialist, I should be concerned with why many, not all by any means, but many working class people are not so unhappy to see gang members deported without due process, or aren't that concerned about the particularities of the due process. And I'll just raise an anecdote that while I was at my daughter's wedding, I ran across a cousin of an in-law whose daughter would have been the same age as my daughter, but she's dead because of a fentanyl overdose that she took by accident, because she got some what she thought were sleeping pills or something. This is apocryphal. It's not exactly the correct, but she took a sleeping pill that happened to have fentanyl and it killed her. And so she's not here anymore. And I was speaking to her mother. And that is, to me, points to a deepening problem that is political and economic. And the politics of it reach well beyond the United States. I was kind of thinking about the way that Trump has used this Aliens Enemies Act to justify the mass deportations and how that might play in certain sectors of societies, because we have seen the collapse of political authority and legitimacy to the South. The monopoly on violence is no longer fully contained within the Mexican state. There's competing governing powers. Half of them are just gangs and cartels and drug dealers, and there has been a variety of attempts to confront and combat that reality, which was arrived through the collapse of the PRI. So it's not as though it's a simple tale there, but there's been an attempt after attempt to turn back the tide on the growing lawlessness in the South, and each attempt has failed. If a direct confrontation, military confrontation, only fragmented the cartels, created more gangs, and spread violence further and spread the drug trade further. Whereas the hugs not bullets approach did nothing to really slow down the escalation of that either. So Trump is saying, listen, the United States is going to use its power within its borders to no longer be a victim of the collapse of political authority in the South. And so your kids aren't going to wake up dead from fentanyl. And I think that would play to a certain, segment of working class.
Yeah, immigration strategies play because there's no economic strategy that offers any alternative. People can't see any kind of way in which the Latin American countries could become more stable and more orderly. And they don't see any kind of way in which immigration from those countries could be anything other than a source of disorder. To change that, we have to actually change the situation in the Latin American states. And this requires real, sustainable, meaningful economic development of those states. They've been underdeveloped for too long. This cannot just be dumping aid money into these states. It can't be transfers. It can't be giving away American tax money to Latin American states. American voters aren't going to wear that. That's not going to go anywhere. What it needs to be is jobs, manufacturing jobs coming to Latin American states. And the strategy for getting those jobs is the trade war. It's to reduce the concentration of manufacturing and production-related jobs in China, and then to spread those jobs to developing states, to create friendships between the United States and developing countries, the same set of countries that were originally parties to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then additional states that were not included in those original discussions during the Obama years. And that set of states included both South Asian states, Southeast Asian states, and Latin American states. And the Latin American side of this is very important. The United States is not going to be able to improve the border situation in any kind of sustainable long-term way. It's not going to be able to manage the migration situation in any sustainable long-term way unless it can get manufacturing jobs in some of these Latin American countries that are poor, that are underdeveloped, that need to become producer states, need to turn into South Korea, Japan, need some kind of trajectory. There needs to be hope in these countries for people living in these countries so that they don't have to join criminal gangs and they don't have to move to the United States if they don't want to. And the way to do that is to have some kind of effective new set of global supply chains that gives the Latin American states a larger role in the system. The trade war is intimately connected to this. And the question of whether the administration can succeed with its trade policy is of immediate and pressing importance here. But we can't get anyone on the left to talk about it or think about it for any length of time because of the demonstrable hegemonic unseriousness.
Right. I mean, I'm going to, risk sounding pro-Trump for a moment here. Not that I haven't already, maybe, but the aim of the tariffs, as I understand them, is not ultimately to completely destroy trade relations between Canada and Mexico, but to rearrange those so that there's a block an American bloc of trade partners with the rest of the world and the development here.
This is why they'll negotiate with anybody. They will turn the tariffs off and have a 90-day negotiation period with every state except for China. In China, the tariff rate sticks and it goes up further. There's a carve out for phones and computers because of the rare earth situation, which the United States has been gradually trying to transform for years now, going back to the Biden administration. But outside of that carve out, which the tech sector has pleaded for and has therefore received, the tariffs on China are the tariffs that stick. Each time he does one of these rounds of trying to have a big new tariff regime, he backs off on every state and agrees to negotiate with every state except for China. There's no trust between the United States and China because of how the negotiations went during the first Trump administration, where the opinion of the American diplomats is that while the individual Chinese diplomats were sincere, they were not backed by Beijing. Beijing would change the wording that had been agreed upon and try to slip the wording past the American diplomats without drawing attention to the fact that they'd changed the wording. And it produced terrible trust issues that still exist between the United States and China and make it very hard for a deal to happen today that would preserve that trade relationship in the form in which it previously existed. So the Trump administration is very open with regard to which states become beneficiaries of its attempt to hit up the Chinese economy for manufacturing jobs. The narrative that the goal is to bring textile jobs back to the United States. I've seen people, educated people with PhDs, acting as if the goal of the administration is to bring clothing manufacturing jobs to the United States. This is not at all the goal of the administration. The administration knows that you can't manufacture clothing in the United States at a price that is globally competitive. There's no effort to bring that industry back to the United States. The question is, where will that industry go? Which countries can get the benefit of displacing some of that activity from China? Indonesia, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, or Peru, Chile, Mexico. Which states? And he is making it a market. He is challenging these states to offer terms that are as favorable as he can get for the United States, rather than having a big group agreement like the TPP, which would give very favorable terms to all of the friends as a bloc.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that the right strategy? Is that going to ultimately result in enough friendshoring to really help these states so that they really get enough of what they need to develop into strong U.S. allies? Or is he negotiating too hard with these states because he wants too many of the jobs to come back to the United States? And will the potential friends ultimately rebuff him or not cut good deals with him because he's playing the game too hard? And will the Republicans in Congress, who are skeptical of all of this, many of them are free trade guys, will they give him enough room to negotiate this so that he appears to have the backing of the party and is a credible negotiating partner? These are the big central questions.
Mm-hmm. Well,
there's news coming out every day related to this stuff, but nobody wants to talk about it.
As a socialist, what I would just, almost dogmatically want to remind people about is that the last round of accumulation of capital, the switch from Fordism to neoliberalism, set up the terms for the crisis we're experiencing now. That the way in which the PRI disintegrated was managed by neoliberal agreements and was a consequence of them, ultimately, I think. And NAFTA, for instance, undermined Mexico's ability to develop at a rate where it can meet its needs well enough in the global market, and set up the basis for the rise of the cartels. So what we are doing now will undoubtedly set up new contradictions and crises within society, which we'll have to address 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. So for a socialist...
Depends on the deals. It actually does depend on the terms of the deals, because sometimes a deal is cut with the United States that does genuinely allow a country to become a South Korea or a Japan or a Germany.
Mhm.
And other times the deal doesn't permit that to happen and instead traps the country in a relationship where it's not really able to properly grow. And if you want a set of strong allies because you want to construct a NATO of the Pacific, then you actually do need the allied states to grow enough that they're able to step into the roles that you have in mind for them.
Right. No, I don't disagree that it could be that Mexico benefits in the next 50 years from the Trump rearrangement, right?
Depending on the details of it.
But then we're
And
going to
that's
be
where the
talking about
details
troops
really
to
matter.
Vietnam again. Then we're going to be talking about troops to Vietnam again, or we're going, you know what I'm saying? Like it's not as though there aren't going to be major losers. And
yes, not
and
every
these-
country can win in this. Certain
Yeah.
countries will win, other countries will still be neglected and underdeveloped. You know, and that's if it goes far enough that it does actually succeed in to some significant extent in changing the supply chains.
the
And
thing
we
about
don't yet know if it will.
the thing about the utopian project of socialism is that it is not a zero-sum game. That the organization of the working class internationally aims at transcending the contradictions in the society so that we are no longer going to just be moving the crisis of capitalism around and kicking the can down the road in order to maintain a broken system indefinitely. So, while I am not going to completely just lose my mind over what Trump is doing with the tariffs and his plan, and I do want to understand it, I also want to understand that it is not going to create the conditions that I am trying to create as a socialist.
Oh, of course not. But it
Right.
will create the conditions that you'll have to organize in as a socialist. And
Right.
so it's pivotal that we actually understand the conditions that are emerging. We can't just respond to all of this stuff with a discussion of the history of Mexico. And we can't just respond to all of this stuff by getting caught up in whatever bourgeois liberal process concern is at the forefront of Democratic Party politics. We
Right.
actually do have to understand the world we're living in. And there's such a tendency to not want to engage with the actual world that we're living in and what is changing about it insofar as it is changing.
Hmm.
Because it's unpleasant, because who's actually driving the change? Elites. Elites are driving the change, not socialists. So what kind of changes are we getting? Changes that serve elite interests and not those of working people. So we don't like the changes. So what? Does that mean that we don't have to understand them? If there's any kind of possibility for socialism, it has to engage with what's actually taking place.
No, I totally agree there. So the question then becomes for socialists to try to recognize the degree to which, some questions come up for me. To what degree do we want stability for our own organizing? And to what degree do we want stability in the United States if we think like I do, that it is still the nation with the most freedom for civil social organizing? So there's that. And then the other question is, how do we, seeing the threats to due process and seeing the way in which a state of exception is being created yet again, try to push for normalizing our politics so that we don't accept every new state of exception that arises.
Part of normalizing our politics is to focus on what seems to be not the constitutional crisis, which is just the banal trade policy.
Mm-hmm.
I have said for years, treat Trump like a normal politician. Look at what he's actually doing, not what the conversation is, and then talk about it as ordinary activity without making him into some kind of special person who represents some special thing separate and distinct from ordinary American democratic politics. It's not, it doesn't have to be that he's this, magic, sinister, orange man, bad man entity that you treat like he's mystical and has magic powers. He's just a guy who has a particular vision of how he thinks the world might be made better. He's attempting to pursue that vision. There are people who disagree with that vision. who are opposing and obstructing that vision in various ways. And then there's a question of what will actually happen when you take into account both what he will try to do and how other players will attempt to resist his moves. One of the things that I think is really striking that nobody's talked about in the last week is that so far the statistics we have on deportations indicate that he's not keeping up with Biden in terms of total deportations. In terms of, for the first, what are we, 4 months in? He is not deported at as rapid a rate, which makes sense. It's not as if there's been a new government budget that has given these guys a bunch of additional money. And he can declare an emergency or whatever, but there has to be congressional funding to really mount the kind of campaign that he'd like to see. And that congressional funding conflicts with his desire to do an extension of the tax cut. There's already a large budget deficit. There's all sorts of fiscal wrangling. The bond rate has gone up. The Federal Reserve rate is not going down. So there's all kinds of problems with trying to do a bunch of additional federal money on trying to deport large numbers of people. This is the reality underlying this frothing of deporting people at universities, sending people to very, very obviously terrible prisons like the one in El Salvador. The function of this is to intimidate, to scare students on university campuses and frighten them, and to scare and rile up liberals and progressives about the conditions in the El Salvador prison. The thing to bear in mind is the guy in El Salvador, he lets people into that prison and wants them to photograph and wants them to see visually what he's doing there. He puts on a show there because his goal is to intimidate his population into not committing crimes. He uses that prison to try to make himself look like he's really in control so as to frighten and intimidate. Trump is borrowing from that strategy by allowing, by having this happen. He is putting all of these photos of the prison in front of you. And you've got people in the United States who don't know what's going on, who think that these are concentration camps that the administration is operating in the United States. They don't realize it's an El Salvador prison and that only one person has been sent to this prison from the United States, so far that we know. They think that it's a concentration camp and that enormous numbers of people are being rounded up inside the territory of the United States, having their heads shaved, put next to each other. This is not what's actually taking place. But the possibility of it, the image of it, has this intimidating effect. And so while the number of deportations trails the number during the Biden years, the number of crossings has dropped significantly.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Far fewer people are coming into the country as a consequence of the very public, very visceral messaging that's coming out. But this is precisely the kind of thing that this administration loves to do. It loves to paper over the fact that it can't act, it can't do things by putting on a show and then triggering the libs into participating in the show. So the libs, in sharing all of the pictures of the guys with the shaved heads, disseminate the propaganda for the administration, which reduces the number of crossings.
Well, listen, I want to say there's a counter narrative to the one you just laid out, which is that the primary explanation for the lower number of deportations under Trump's first 4 months as compared to Biden's isn't due to a lack of budget for ICE or a lack of manpower to implement the deportations, but is actually due to the lack of the lower number of crossings. And if you look at the Biden administration's deportations, they occurred mostly along the border and were immediate and reactive to illegal crossings. They weren't targeting people who had been in the country for a while and then deporting them, but rather were happening at the border. So
yes, so if you look at the heat map, it's still the case that the deportations are principally occurring in South Texas, because that's where the largest possible quantity will tend to appear in the areas that are closest to the border.
So the explanation for the lower rate of deportations under Trump is the lower rate of illegal crossings.
Well, that's part of the story, but their goal is to deport on the level of Barack Obama in 2009. Their goal is to get 500,000 or close to 500,000 a year so that they can achieve the target J.D. Vance set of 1 million deportations. They're not going to get to that. They're not going to get to that. They're not going to come close to even the Barack Obama level from 2009. And these people who are making it out like he's operating concentration camps, they had nothing to say about Barack Obama in 2009 deporting 400,000 people a year. They had nothing to say about the drone striking of American citizens that Barack Obama engaged in, killing American citizens without due process that Barack Obama engaged in. They don't care about this stuff, really. Their goal is to get Trump out because they think Orange Man bad. They think he's a fascist and a Nazi. And that's really all that there is to it. There's not any kind of principled stance at play for many of these people.
All right, well, listen.
They're just completely controlled by the magnet of, oh, look at the photos of the people in the El Salvador prison. There's no thinking that takes place.
Well, the underlying argument you're making is that the United States under Trump and perhaps under Biden before him, or perhaps since the pandemic, I'm not quite sure when, is just less capable of action. The way it's shut, and that
there could be resources deployed if they really wanted to deport large numbers of people who have been in the country for a long time. And this is what they said. They said their goal was not just to keep up with new crossings, but to deport large numbers of people who have been in the country for a long time. They would need real serious resources to do that. They are not in position to accomplish that. They're simply not. Materially, they're not. For everything that they say, they have not been allocated the resources to actually do what it is that they've set out to do. And they're papering over that by treating specific individuals very, very badly in a very high profile way. And look, we can all acknowledge they are treating these specific individuals extraordinarily badly. This is not about whether we acknowledge this or whether we think they're being badly treated. And the moment our analysis becomes subjected to, are we sufficiently normatively opposed in a sufficiently public way to what's going on? The assumption here is that if people like you and me cry about this enough on YouTube in front of other people, that will be some kind of effective measure, or that if people just go out on these weekend demonstrations that they're going out on now, weekend demonstrations where they give notice to local authorities, and then mostly students and retirees protest outside of work hours on the weekend. This kind of stuff, this is not politics. This does not offer meaningful opposition to the administration. It's playing, it's entertainment for people. It doesn't actually accomplish anything. And this has to be understood and grasped by us, just how completely inert it all is.
No, I do agree with your primary point, but I am concerned about protecting due process and protecting.
Of course. The thing is, this is going to go through the courts, and it's going to go through the courts regardless of what we do. And at this point, it's already in motion in the courts. These people, they've already got lawyers. It's already happening. There's nothing you and I are going to do that is going to affect that process in any meaningful way.
No, but what we need to do, I think, is understand just what the differences are when it comes to the threat to due process or the First Amendment between now and what the threat was under Biden, and what would be necessary to truly address these threats in a way that doesn't, especially in a way so that our own politics doesn't reinforce the mechanism.
Of course, we need to be committed to free speech. And it's in part because the left was not committed to free speech in the last decade because it thought that it was in charge, and it thought, therefore, that it could censor only the bad things. The left imagined that it was in charge and therefore didn't need to be committed to free speech. It contributed to an environment in which this is possible.
Yeah, but
with its attitude to free speech and its behavior.
And so today, we just need to take time. I want to talk about the Perkins Coie case next. So we need to be committed to understanding the depth of the problem that we're facing, is what I'm trying to get at. And so, for instance, with Perkins Coie, the arguments that the commitment to the First Amendment means standing up for the rights of Perkins Coie, I think is misplaced. And I think you have to look at the actual executive order that Trump put forward that targeted Perkins Coie and other law firms, the basis for that executive order, and the degree to which it can be said to be a First Amendment issue at all. So my feeling is that the reality of Perkins Coie, the Perkins Coie cases, that's what's really being exposed here, is the degree to which the most elite law firms in this country are entwined with the state and with the parties as well. So what you're talking about when it comes to these executive orders is an attempt to undermine the ability of the Democratic Party to be effective politically through the bureaucracy and through the courts. That's, I think, what Trump is aiming to do with these executive orders. And he has a basis in law and the basic framework of the separation of powers to do what he's doing. And it is simply not the case that there's something Nazi-like about these particular orders. They are perhaps, there's a little bit of overreach, maybe. But just to walk through it briefly, the basis for the Perkins Coie targeting, for trying to take away their security clearance, no longer grant them government contracts, and then this is a big one, the part that's the most controversial, and rightly so, ban them from federal buildings. The basis for all that is that they participated in a kind of fraud against the American public, and that had an impact on the election. They participated in a campaign finance violation, which would obscured the money trail to the creation of a dossier, which was pivotal in terms of evidence to justify an FBI investigation into a sitting president, which then went on to have detrimental effects not only on that president's ability to govern, but also on our foreign relations with Russia, helping, I would say, this is a political argument, speculative, but helping to set up the coming war, proxy war in Ukraine. So you have a law firm participating in a campaign finance violation and the creation of a fraudulent, fictitious dossier on a president, which was basically part of an October surprise, a dirty trick, which is actually normal within U.S. politics. And so this is where things get weird, because on the one hand, in terms of the way we want our politics to operate, it is exceptional, it is corrupt, but in reality, it is par for the course, right? So when Trump tries to excise one of the players that participated in the normal level of corruption and fraud in a U.S. election, he can be seen as like targeting his political enemies and abusing the process.
It depends on how you understand democracy. And part of what is going on in the United States is that there's a deep disagreement about what democracy means, what it involves, what is the appropriate role of bureaucrats, technocrats, civil servants in democratic politics. And that's a disagreement that to some degree will be litigated by the courts, to some degree will be litigated by the Congress. It's one that I think increasingly this kind of disagreement is occurring in more and more countries. And we saw it in a very intense way in the UK, where you had the proroguing of Parliament and the question about whether the Prime Minister should answer to Parliament or answer to the result of the Brexit referendum. And there was talk of a possible coup at one point. Had Boris Johnson executed an executive coup? Was he acting like Viktor Orban? But of course, in point of fact, the democratic procedures of the British state, such as they are, still worked in the sense that it was still possible to remove Boris Johnson from power through internal party politics, and then it was still possible for the Conservative Party to lose political power at the next election. All of that still operated despite this conversation about threats to democracy, whether there was some kind of fascist or a liberal thing going on. And I think similarly here, if you understand democracy in the minimal sense to be elections that are competitive, where it is possible for different parties to win, in that very minimal sense, I think we still have that. We're going to have competitive midterms. The president himself has acknowledged that the midterms are a concern for him. There's going to be another presidential election in 2028. It might be won by a Democrat. It might be won by Stephen A. Smith. I don't think that we are in a situation where we don't have democracy in that kind of minimal sense. The thing is, people have much more expansive notions of democracy that include many additional things, often many things that go beyond what any actual existing ostensible liberal democracy has managed to achieve, procedurally or substantively. And so we're going to go through, and we have been going through, a period where people use the concept of democracy as a stick to demand things that are substantive in character or are procedural, but not necessarily obviously intrinsically connected with the concept of democracy. And they're going to use these different understandings to try to frame their opponents as authoritarian for the purposes of trying to make their opponents seem scary and frightening and unacceptable. And this has been going on in American politics in both directions. Both sides have done this. They've both framed the other as opposed to democracy as it ought to be understood. And I think we ought to take seriously that each side does think eminently in its self-understanding of itself as committed to democracy, rightly understood. The issue is that there is no agreement right now on what that means, and there's no obvious mechanism, therefore, of resolving the disagreement. But there is a shared understanding that if we were to deviate from competitive multi-party elections and go to something obviously different from democracy at that basic level, that would be a very dangerous situation. And it's that agreement that it would be dangerous to not have competitive multi-party elections that allows us to continue even as many of the procedures are being litigated and are the subject of very intense contestation.
Right. What I would point out is that in the future, if we actually had a socialist party, right, that was functional, it would have to have its own version of Perkins Coie. Okay. It would have to have legal firms that were committed to socialism and participating in our activity and helping to protect the party. And it's very likely that some sort of executive order or legislation would come along to say, you guys are not getting any security clearances. I mean, I wouldn't expect the Socialist Party version of Perkins Coie ever to get a security clearance, right? And also, we're not getting federal contracts. That probably would be taken for granted as well. But this last one, to be banned from federal buildings, to not be able to represent the party in court, that would be a true threat to the operations of a socialist version of Perkins Coie.
And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a limited judicial ruling which revoked that part.
Right. Well, the way they're doing it now with Perkins Coie is they're saying on a case-by-case basis, the agencies involved with Perkins Coie must evaluate the degree to which Perkins Coie is threatening national security by participating or gaining access to a federal building. So what that will mean is setting up a terrible bureaucratic process of evaluation every time they try to get into court, right? So it basically is throwing gum into the works of the machine of Perkins Coie, making it might as well just revoke their business license almost, but not quite, and I don't think that is going to stand in the long term with Perkins Coie, but I don't know. But I would certainly not want that for a socialist version of Perkins Coie.
Often government actions that target specific entities rather than make policy in a more neutral way do get ultimately overturned by the courts. Government actions that target very specific businesses, firms, or organizations.
No, but I don't think so. I don't think that you can really say that these law firms are being targeted maliciously, or that it's merely political. Because in the case of Perkins Coie, they actually did participate in acts of what I'll call fraud. That may be too strong legally, but I'll call fraud, which would justify the executive to place him under suspicion. And if you're going to implement a policy, let's say along DEI, saying, okay, we're going to really roll back DEI. We're not going to have contracts with legal firms that still have DEI policies. You can implement it in a practical way by taking the worst offenders on a variety of levels and targeting them first. So I don't think that you can really say it's merely politically motivated, given the actual track record of Perkins Coie and other law firms that did commit these kinds of acts. So
this is the tricky thing. A lot of this stuff, there is a debate, a political debate about how political this stuff is. One of the things that we are contesting is whether this is political in character in the first place. You know, there's a book by Lorna Finlayson called "The Political is Political," which is it's a great title for a book, but very much about this. You know, when you get to a point where you disagree about what the bounds of the political are, there's something political even about attempting to contest the bounds in various ways, which makes it quite difficult.
I would just say that the president is political. He's a politician who was elected to implement a political platform, and he is not overstepping the bounds of the constitutional framework when he targets these particular law firms in the way that he does, because he can justify that on the basis of both his platform, the desire to clear away the corruption in the bureaucracy that emerged through the Russiagate scandal that revealed itself there, and also the rollback DEI. He has a political mandate to do that. And so, and then the question is he using the bureaucracy inappropriately, overstepping his authority as the executive in the process?
Some of this will come down to, do they think he's politically motivated in the behavior, which will come down to also presentation perhaps of evidence concerning what motivated him to sign the act. And it will be affected by the justice's impression of the sincerity of his conduct more broadly.
When they say politically motivated, what they often mean is he acting out of personal animus. Is it a matter of his own personal power and his personal feeling of being wronged or something like that?
That would be a narrow way of construing it. But depending on how they're feeling about him, and then it becomes a question of which judges do you get? Does it go to the Supreme Court? What does the Supreme Court ultimately want to do in that instance, which will be affected by the other cases they've been hearing and their perception of his conduct in those other cases. So, and that's some of the value in throwing a lot of judicial cases up, is that it gives the court a lot of different things to think about. And these cases, of course, are not supposed to affect each other, but inevitably do.
I would simply argue, if I was defending Trump in front of a judge, I would simply argue, when John F. Kennedy wanted to roll back the CIA, fired the head of the CIA, cut its budget, tried to shrink it after he felt betrayed by them around the Bay of Pigs invasion, we could easily say that he was motivated by personal animus and his own desire to protect his political power. But he was also acting in what he perceived to be the national interests. And as the elected president of the United States, that was what he was brought into power to do. And you cannot split apart a president's sense of their own political authority and power and the necessity to maintain it, and their actual jobs and responsibilities as president. And so, if they're trying to take out their political enemies, if they have justified reasons to do so, you can't fault them for that.
But also that argument makes it very difficult to discern at what point would it be a political motivation? At what point would it be classified that way? And since the law has this category, there has to be something that is within it. That's one of the dangers of creating legal categories. Once you make a legal category, something has to be in it. And that's the danger that we're seeing with the category of terrorism. Once you create a legal category like that, well, something is in it. And there's a question of how much, but there's at least something in that box. And this is allowed with terrorism to be kicked out of the country on the basis of posting Palestine tweets.
No, but here's the thing. When it comes to saying, okay, we're not going to take contracts with these law firms anymore, that the executive has a lot of discretion there. He doesn't even need to come up with an excuse.
Yeah,
right.
But the letting them, into federal buildings thing, I think
No,
that
right.
is something that could provoke a ruling which at least limits the scope of the order.
And I would agree with that ruling, because it does seem to me there's another process to put a law firm out of business, and that isn't in the purview of the executive. That's not where that should be decided.
If the law firm has conducted itself in some kind of bad way, there is, yes, as you say, a process for dealing with that. And the executive order seems to be on some level an admission that you can't prevail in that process. So if you know that you can't prevail in that process, then why would you have grounds to do the order? Well, you'd have to then claim that the organization which oversees that process is itself politically captured in some way. This would be a difficult argument to make in front of a court.
Right. But on the other hand, what they could say is, oh, no. Look, we're not trying to put them out of business. We're just trying, given their record, we're trying to make sure that when they enter into a federal building, they're not, continuing their fraudulent, attack on America and its values and its institutions, which they've done in the past. We have to evaluate them because of their track record, but we're not going to block them, uniformly. We just want a process of review. And that's within the power and authority of each one of these heads of these agencies, which they're trying to gain admission to.
Ultimately, the extent of the powers is itself the thing that is being politically contested right now. So even these attempts to operate within agreed upon limits are very difficult, because those limits are no longer agreed upon and they're very mobile right now.
Right.
But that doesn't mean there's a constitutional crisis. It means that there is profound disagreement, which produces a lot of legal wrangling that can produce seemingly contradictory responses from the system in different instances, confused and imperfect and flawed responses in many cases, sometimes downright horrible decisions that we have every reason to greatly dislike. But it is the character of the kind of situation we're in to have a sort of permanent contestation of the procedures that operates continuously at every point. And it was operating when Barack Obama and Joe Biden put out a bunch of executive orders that were dubious in character, where it wasn't clear if they were actually within the powers of the president to pursue those various orders. And all of them then did have to go through the court system. And it creates an enormous legal backlog, and it's a big pain in the neck for everybody involved. But this is because the Congress isn't able to come together and pass legislation. And so the executive branch tries to fill in the gap with executive orders.
Right. And that may not maintain forever. It could be that the Congress gets its act together. But if we were to imagine that there was a socialist party, dream the big dream here with me, Benjamin. We imagine that there's a socialist party in America, then we would need to know how these battles are fought in reality, and not just sign up with the framing of the Democratic Party, which is purely rhetorical acts. These are all acts of demagoguery.
This is why I'm not taking either side in it and going, look at the character of it. It's a situation in which there's very deep, intense contestation, and where if you take either side in it, a large chunk of people will accuse you of being an authoritarian or apologizing for some kind of authoritarianism, either the authoritarianism of the president or the authoritarianism of the bureaucratic machine. One or the other.
The other thing I'll note is that beyond, the party apparatuses themselves, like outside of the Beltway, and that's the wrong way to put it. Outside of DC, outside of the NGO class, there is not a voting bloc that gives a shit about the rights of Perkins Coie, and no one's going to really rally into the streets to defend these, fat cats and their law firms and their partners and so forth, their billion-dollar company. No one's going to care about that. We might imagine, though, that if there were such a thing as a socialist party with a law firm that was aligned with it, that we could mobilize the people into the streets to combat and push back when they were banned from federal buildings, that there would be more loyalty and more of a connection to the masses.
If it was clear that the organization was actually doing something that advanced the interests of ordinary working people, then you could expect there to be some level of solidarity with it if its legal status were called into question. Part of the trouble is that there is no no credibility on the part of any segment of the left in that regard. There is no widespread belief that any of the activities of the left serve or help in any way ordinary working people. And the symptom of that that's most visible to me in the last week is that you can't even get people on the left to talk about trade policy for any length of time, the stuff that actually affects the ordinary working people, not just in the United States, but internationally. This is a question that affects workers in Indonesia, workers in Peru, in Mexico, in Chile, in India, all over the world. So many people have a stake in what's going on right now, and you can't get them to care. You really can't. They just don't.
Well, I'm sorry if I didn't talk about it enough in this session. We should talk about it next time again. We should continue to talk about it because I agree with you. It is look, it's clear the independent voters who were supporting Trump have dropped away from him as they have become concerned about their economic stability during this trade war. And it is hurting Trump's presidency that he is creating conditions of instability and precarity for working people, waged people in the United States. And that is his weakness. And the fact that the opposition party doesn't quite know how to take advantage of that in a way that makes sense.
Should be an opportunity for us, but unfortunately, we're too stupid to avail ourselves of it. We have a lack of capacity to think and to stay with things that are hard. And so we don't even avail ourselves of the enormous openings that they create all the time with their myopia and their inability to focus on anything serious. We replicate their failures instead of transcending them.
Yeah, I agree. Next week is going to be the Culture Corner. So, but the week after that, why don't we do a session just on what a fictional socialist party is, if we had a socialist party, what would its stance be towards Trump's tariffs? I'll come up with a catchier title than that, or maybe I won't, but I'll try. And
that would be a great question in itself.
Yeah.
But who knows? There also could be things that happen over the course of the next 2 weeks that we have to talk about.
Yeah, but we don't have to be dictated to by the news cycle. Let's just commit.
Yeah,
right
but
now.
related to this, we might have to update on some of what happens depending on what takes place. The thing about this trade war is that stuff happens really quickly, and there are often, surprises along the way.
Yeah. Listen, I want to just throw this on the screen here. Matt says, good. More daydreams. Just what we need. Well, listen, look, Matt, you don't have to be a socialist. It's fine. If you just want to be a Democrat or Republican and operate on the level that anything beyond capitalism is a daydream or a pipe dream or unrealistic, that's fine. And who knows? I can't say. Maybe you're right. But that's not how I function. That's not what I do here. So
yeah, socialists would have to have some kind of alternative economic vision that's superior to what the two parties are offering, that seems to have a real path that's tractable, that's possible for ordinary working people. And as long as socialists are not engaged with formulating that, they're not playing the game of attempting to lead in any way, shape, or form. And they're just tailing one side or the other side, offering rearguard defenses of what one side or the other side does. So to develop any kind of independence, you have to have your own view on the central major structural problems, crises, and questions of the day.
That's right. All right, listen, we've got to have we're going to do the after party in about 10 minutes on Zoom. Join us on Patreon for that. I'm sure it will be just as good or better than the conversation you just witnessed. Ben, thank you very much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets